Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to the 10th Denman Forestry Issues Series entitled Effect of Global Climate Change on Northwest Forest. We look forward to an exciting and informative program this afternoon. The purpose of the Denman Forestry Issues Series is to provide information and discussion on timely forestry and natural resource issues. As with the activities associated with an academic setting, our ultimate goal is to inform and educate our students, faculty, and staff, as well as resource professionals, landowners, and the general public. These programs are made possible through the generous support provided by the Denman Endowment for Student Excellence in Forest Resources, and they support the college's vision of being a world-class and internationally recognized source of knowledge relevant to environmental and natural resource issues. The mission of the College of Forest Resources is to study and investigate the sustainability and functionality of complex natural resource and environmental systems in both natural and managed environments using an interdisciplinary approach across multiple spatial and temporal scales to include our urban, suburban, and wildland landscapes. In our college, we focus on programs in sustainable forestry, sustainable urban environments, and sustainable forest enterprises. Sustainability serves as the cornerstone of our programs and includes all resources such as timber, water, wildlife, or insects, for example, considers the needs of future generations as well as those of the present, and strives for a dynamic equilibrium that balances ecological functions and conditions with social and economic factors. Today, we wish to discuss two related topics of extreme importance to the sustainability of our Northwest forest. The first topic relates to predicted changes that may occur in the Northwest climate over the next 100 years. And the second topic relates to possible projected impacts of such changes on our Northwest forest. Together, these projected impacts might seriously affect the sustainability of our forest, at least as we know them today. Regarding the first topic, climate changes in the Northwest, some examples of estimated climate impacts include global warming, where the average global temperatures might increase 2 to 5 degrees centigrade over the next 100 years, drier summers and wetter winters that might occur across western North America, and CO2, the principal greenhouse gas levels that are likely to increase. Each of these predictions is very uncertain in magnitude, especially as we focus on smaller geographical regions such as the Northwest. Regarding the second topic, how will trees and forest ecosystems react to these estimated changes, we might expect tree species distributions to change, increased physiological stresses may occur, forest fires may occur more frequently and be more intense, biodiversity might be adversely affected, and forest productivity may either increase or decrease. Again, much uncertainty surrounds these possibilities. The range and population sizes of tree species may change dramatically. We must understand that natural and managed forests will likely differ significantly in their responses to climate changes. In addition, wildlife effects are poorly understood, but nature reserves may be adversely affected. We may expect significant changes in hydrological cycles affecting snowfall, rain, floods, and droughts. And forest ecosystems may face increased vulnerability to invasive species. Forest may help to mitigate some of these effects. For example, we can develop explicit strategies to sequester carbon so forests act as carbon sinks. We can develop ecosystem strategies that maintain and preserve existing forests, strategies that aim to increase the area of land under forest, and strategies that increase the tree density on forest land, therefore increasing the amount of carbon per acre. We may also decide to use biomass in place of fossil fuels to a larger extent. And lastly, we may focus on the use of wood in place of steel, cement, aluminum, and plastics. These and other topics are the subject of this presentation. And with us today are speakers from government agencies and institutions of higher education. Our topic again is the effect of global climate change on Northwest forest. And our moderator for the rest of the program is Faculty Chair Rick Gustafson from the UW College of Forest Resources.
Our first speaker is Tom Hinckley. Tom is a professor of forestry physiology here in the College of Forest Resources. Tom has several research interests, but one of those is how trees, and this is from the whole tree down to the cellular level, respond to environmental stresses, including climate change, and is particularly interested in water and nutrient relations, carbon economy, and growth of trees from diverse ecosystems. The title of this presentation is an interesting one. It's Individual Plants in a Greenhouse World. Is the steroid analogy appropriate? Tom?
Rick, thank you very much. We're going to take a slightly different tack today. We're going to look at the role that elevated CO2 in particular has on individual plants. And the steroid analogy comes about because CO2 is a limiting resource, or similar to nitrogen, and therefore elevated CO2 should, using the steroid analogy, pump up the plant. So that's what we're going to look at. The particular way I'm going to approach this, we're going to look at the historical record, and there's really two important lessons that come out of it that are transferable here. What does climate change mean, so that we're all on the same page? What are some of the proposed outcomes? And here you see the emergence of the steroid analogy. One of them is that planet Earth will green as a result of elevated CO2 via either increased productivity or increased plant distribution. And the other option is there's a series of complex changes that will occur, and that these changes are likely to be species and location dependent. And we're then going to look at some actual real examples that are occurring now. The two, I think, critical lessons from the historical record that bear remembering are that species respond individualistically. It's not groups, it's not communities, it's not ecosystems, it's species. And then the second one is that established organisms have been resistant to change. And I think a lot in plantation forestry, this is really a very important part of how plantation forestry will differ from natural forestry. So what is climate change for Washington mean? Well, we already know that carbon dioxide levels have increased about 32% from pre-industrial levels. That carbon dioxide will likely continue to increase, and the increase will be to 500 plus or minus parts per million. It's important to remember that for plants, CO2 is a fertilizer. Temperature will increase, there will be less snow water and less snow water. What does this mean for the individual tree? Well, the increased CO2 should act as a fertilizer. And as a result, tree growth should increase. And the question is this true? And my premise is that where it is moist or the soil is deep, this is likely to be true. Where it is dry, where the stand is dense, or where the soil is thin, or some combination, there seem to be two outcomes at this level. Trees may close stomata, the pores in the foliage that control gas exchange, save water and survive, but not be more productive. Or mortality may occur and actually may increase as a result of other factors acting. The important summary from this is that the outcome will be variable in both time and space. So how do we measure the response of trees to carbon dioxide? And there are really two broad methods to do this. There's the technologically interesting and expensive methods, and those are shown on both the right and side there, right and left sides. and these are quite elaborate and quite expensive. And there are older, much more inexpensive techniques involving natural carbon dioxide springs. These occur in Italy. In Australia, for example, carbon dioxide gas comes out of these springs and forms a natural gradient where concentrations as high as 1,000 parts per million are found at the mouth of the spring and decrease then to ambient levels along the edge. Plants, trees can be measured in such a system. So then how do trees, we know that CO2 may act as a fertilizer. There's been studies on this. So what are the results from those particular studies? In simple systems, and what I mean by simple systems, single species, young plants, grown in greenhouses or growth chambers for short periods of time, there's a uniform increase in productivity, and it's about, it's can be as much as 50%, but generally less. As the system becomes more complex, mixes of species, longer time periods, older material, the average and the maximum decrease and the responses become increasingly variable. There are 4 troubling pieces of information that exist regarding the response of plants and trees to CO2. First, the response of invasive species appears to be more vigorous or robust than native species. Second, the maximum ability, particularly of trees in natural stands, their ability to increase in productivity, that ability may have already been achieved, and that further increases in CO2 may not result in further increases in productivity. And then what is the behavior of insects and disease organisms in both a climate change environment, but also an environment in which now the tree has also responded to that climate change, and then how the nutrient cycling change. So the system is far more complex and therefore more variable and uncertain than the simple initial response that trees will increase in productivity. So let's look at this. And we're going to look at this using the red lettering as sort of the positive side, that genetics sets the productive potential of a tree, and then elevated CO2, a good site, good management, and warmer temperatures all will coalesce to actually increase tree productivity or more closely enable a tree to match its genetic potential. However, there are some negatives. All sites aren't good. Stands tend to be too dense. Drought exists, and drought will increase as a result of temperature increases. Diseases and insects are prevalent. Air pollution is prevalent. And all of these things may actually reduce then the productivity of trees. So this is a caveat. It depends is an important thing to carry forward. And we're going to actually look at some specific examples in detail to better understand. We have a little bit of an understanding about trees, but let's put them in groups or stands and try to increase our understanding that way. And we'll do that by selecting 3 different examples. The first example we're going to look at is the spruce bark beetle in Alaska. The second is the combination of drought and bark beetles in pinyon pine of the basin and desert Southwest. I've chosen pinyon pine, which I didn't realize until about 3 months ago, is the 3rd largest forest type in the United States. And then the final example is the mountain pine beetle and lodgepole pine in British Columbia. So the spruce bark beetle in Alaska, about 3.2 million acres are affected, mostly on the Kenai Peninsula, but in other areas. If you read the sort of the articles, both scientific and paper articles about it, the conjecture is that it's been drier, summer temperatures have been warmer, stands are dense, tree health and vigor has declined, and importantly, the life cycle of this particular bark beetle, because of these warmer temperatures, has actually been accelerated. So instead of taking 2 years to complete a life cycle, it's either 1.5 years or a year to do that. Is there evidence for that? Well, here's the Alaska statewide temperature. So this is not just the Kenai, but Alaska statewide temperature for the period of June to August, and it goes back to a little bit before 1920. And you'll notice in the last 20 years, it's been surprisingly warm during this summer growing period. And notice that 2004 was really very warm, almost 4.7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the average. This was also a summer of unusual fires in Alaska. 6.6 million acres burned this last summer. What about pinyon pine? So this is a picture taken near the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona, looking north. This is May 17th. So there's two species out here. There's a juniper and there's a pine. So I want you to look at this as I move then a September picture onto the screen. The brown is the pinyon pine, and the green is still the juniper. The estimate is in the next couple of years that probably 90% of the pinyon pine that we know in this region is likely to be dead. So what are the causes of this particular death? Well, there's a number of them. Climate change is clearly one, but this region is also undergoing a drought. And I'm going to differentiate drought from climate change in that drought can be just a weather-related and not a persistent pattern. Fire suppression has been an important element here. The development of dense stands, heavy grazing over the last century, and insect activity. And whether there isn't, I haven't been able to find any evidence whether this insect activity has increased as a result of the particular climate and drought, but clearly the tree factors and the tree in the stand factors are related to this increase in mortality. And we can look at that. Here's a picture of the San Francisco Peak in 1892. And we see in the foreground a buggy and sort of an open environment. And let's jump now to last year. And notice all the brown trees, those are the pinyon pine in this particular scene. Okay, much denser environment. Final example, mountain pine beetle in British Columbia. In 1990, and mountain pine beetle has been a problem of the West ever since probably lodgepole pine has existed in the West. There was a period from about 1985 until the mid-90s that it wasn't really a significant problem in British Columbia, but starting about 1999 to 2000, it has become an increasingly significant problem. In 1999, there was about 400,000 acres affected. Perhaps not as severely affected as the photograph illustrates, but affected nevertheless. By 2004, there was 17 million acres in British Columbia affected. Alberta had problems. You will see problems in Idaho, Montana, also as you drive. This is an area about the size of West Virginia. In fact, it's actually greater than the size of West Virginia. It's closer to South Carolina. If you add the other insect problems now undergoing in Alaska, you will note almost 25 million acres of affected forest land. Now, one might say, all right, this is just a natural process. Canada signed the Kyoto Protocol. One of the elements of their goals in signing the Kyoto Protocol was to use the natural sequestration of carbon by forests to help them meet the goal. And in fact, they were anticipating their western forest would sequester 44 million pounds of carbon. Well, that's no longer an option. And the increased mortality and now the fire risk from all of this, that's not going to be a way that Canada is able to achieve its commitment to the Kyoto Protocol. So trees may be a risky route for trying to acquire, at least in wild natural stands. What about the Pacific Northwest? Prolonged drought. Well, we're under actually a surprisingly long prolonged drought that the last really significant wet period was 98, 99. We have a particularly low snowpack this year. Water shortages. There's been a declaration by both the state and both municipalities of Seattle and Tacoma are now considering a water shortage ban. There's increased risk of fire, and then there comes the question, how are trees going to respond to this? And this really comes down to, it depends. There's this huge uncertainty. At the upper elevational limit, something like mountain hemlock may actually respond in a positive fashion. The growing season may be longer. Snow melt will occur sooner, and as a result of the warmer environment, it may actually do better. We may see increased recruitment in these upper elevation stands. At the lower elevation limit, however, we may see increased mortality, a loss of vigor, increased disease and insect problems. Highly variable and increasingly uncertain. Summary. There will be good news. CO2 does act as a steroid. It is a fertilizer. And it may be great for plants. There is and will be bad news. And the important thing about the good and bad news is that they're going to be spatially and temporally separated. That is, predicting exactly where it's going to be good or for how long it's going to be good, and predicting where it's going to be bad and how long is going to be difficult. And uncertainty creates, obviously, problems. There will be change. Sort of the bottom take-home message, there will be change, and with change comes increased risk and uncertainty. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Our next speaker is Dave Peterson. Dave is a research biologist with the Pacific Wildland Fire Sciences Laboratory, and that's affiliated with the U.S. Forest Service. And he's also a professor here at the College of Forest Resources. He's been involved in fire ecology and fire science research since 1980. And in addition to those projects, he's now the project manager for the Western Mountain Initiative, which is focused on the effects of global climate change, including fire, on mountain ecosystems in the western United States. The title of his talk is Northwest Forests in a Greenhouse World. Dave.
Well, thank you, Rick. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the Denman series for the opportunity to talk to you today about one of my favorite topics. It was about 12 years ago that I was asked to give a presentation with approximately this same title, and I felt a little insecure at that time because we had so little data at that point in time, and I was really using a lot of wild guesses about what we might expect in the future. But I can stand here today with a lot more confidence because we have collected a lot of empirical data over the last decade or so. And most of the things I'm going to tell you today, I can say with considerable certainty in terms of trends and outcomes of climate change. So I hope I can give you much better information today than I did 12 years ago. In our laboratory at the Forest Service and here at the University of Washington in the College of Forest Resources, we've used a variety of techniques to try to understand how forests might respond to climatic variability and change. We've used studies of the past, or paleoecology, in order to try to understand how previous climates interacted with forest ecosystems. We've used current measurements, tree growth, tree regeneration, and so forth to try to understand how things are changing on the landscape today. And we've used a variety of computer simulation models to try to project our empirical data into the future and make some at least educated guesses about what the future might hold. One of the real gifts that we've had in the last decade or so is the advance of the scientific understanding of the atmospheric dynamics of the Earth, particularly climate variability, which acts on multi-decadal scales. We know quite a bit about year-to-year variation, but it's only recently we've understood this business of multi-decadal variability. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation is something that was, the initial pioneering work was done by University of Washington scientists, and it's a very important organizing feature of climate in the Pacific Northwest, and that's why I highlight it in my talk. We look at these maps of the Earth. A lot of you have probably seen these kinds of things when you've read stories about El Nino in the newspaper, and you see this red bubble that floats back and forth across the equator. What we're concerned is the blue cool and the red warm bubbles here in the Pacific Northwest and North Pacific. And when Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or PDO, as I'll refer to it from now on, is in its warm phase, that warm pool is located here along the coast. When it's in its cool phase, we have cool water along the coast. What this means is when it's in the warm phase, we tend to have warmer, drier weather in the Pacific Northwest, and just the opposite when it's in the cool phase. We have cool, wet weather. So I'll refer to these over the next few minutes as warm and cool phases of the PDO. These occur in about a 20 to 30 year cycle of generally warm, generally cool periods, but with a lot of variation from year to year. So these are just general trends that we have seen occur across the 20th century. Now, the beauty of this is it gives us periods of time that have been predominantly warmer or cooler, and we can see how forest resources have responded to those warmer, cooler periods of time in the past. That gives us some insight into how forest ecosystems might respond in the future. Now, when people think of Pacific Northwest forests, they tend to think of our rather magnificent low-elevation coniferous forests on the west side of the Cascades. And I have to admit that when we first started our research on those forests, I felt, well, the climate is sufficiently benign and these trees have so much resources that climate change would not particularly affect tree species in this location. But as we've learned in the last few years, the data say otherwise. And in fact, it turns out that both precipitation and temperature are very important to the tree growth in low elevation forests, whether we're talking about the lush rainforest types in the Olympic Peninsula, in some areas of the Cascades, or if we're talking about our Douglas fir western hemlock forest, where we are mostly dominated by second growth forests at this point. So these are all factors, El Nino being another one, and PDO. And when PDO is in its warm phase and we have an El Nino year, and we have low summer precipitation and high temperature, these things all limit summer soil moisture. So you don't think about soil moisture as being a particularly limiting factor in the Pacific Northwest, but it is. We have dry summers. On average, we have dry summers. And to the extent that these things limit long-term soil moisture recharge, they also can reduce the growth of trees in the low elevation west side systems. Let's turn now to east side systems. We'd almost certainly expect that east side systems, which are in considerably drier environments, would be limited by summer soil moisture. And in fact, that's true. That came out exactly as you would expect. Winter precipitation is the most important factor affecting east side forest growth, species like ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. The PDO, when it's in its warm phase, is very limiting to tree growth. When it's in its wet phase and we have more snowmelt, we have greater recharge of summer soil moisture, and species like ponderosa pine can grow faster. So this came out pretty much as we might have expected it. We've also dedicated a considerable amount of time to studying our high elevation forests in the Cascades and Olympics. And here we have species such as mountain hemlock, subalpine fir, and Professor Hinckley already alluded to this fact that in fact, these species respond in somewhat of an opposite way to some of the other species. In this case, trees that are growing in a very snowy environment actually can have too much precipitation. If you're covered by snow for 11 months of the year, that's a real limiting factor. So in years when snowfall is less, if you get an extra month, that's a big deal. You've increased your growth period by 100%. So the length of the growing season is incredibly important, not only for tree growth, but for tree regeneration. So in general, in these very snowy, high elevation environments, the less the snowpack, the faster the trees grow, and the more successful regeneration is. So all of these factors, winter precipitation and spring and summer temperature as it affects snowmelt, and whether or not you're in the warm and dry phase of PDO, all affect the duration of the growing season. So this is a good generalization that we have found to be true throughout the Pacific Northwest in the Cascade and Olympic Mountains. So just to summarize what I've said so far, these are the limiting factors that we found in our dominant forest ecosystems. For our low elevation forests, summer soil moisture is really the thing to pay attention to. In our dry east side forest, again, summer soil moisture is also limiting. But in our subalpine forests, the duration of the growing season is the most important factor that limits tree growth and regeneration. And to some extent, some of the lower and drier subalpine forests are also limited by summer soil moisture. So there is some variation depending on which portion of the landscape you're looking at. Now let's switch gears a little bit. We've been talking about small changes in temperature, gradual changes in growth, gradual changes in forest regeneration. But as Professor Hinckley mentioned in his presentation, there are a lot of other things that make the situation a lot more complex, particularly the prospect of ecological disturbance. There's going to be some surprises, almost certainly, in the future. And things like fire, insect attack in particular, can cause rather rapid and dramatic changes in ecosystems, much bigger changes than we would ever have caused by small changes in temperature from year to year or decade to decade. Just to give you an example of the interaction between climate and temperature, I'd like to start off with this particular diagram. I know a lot of you have probably seen this. This is a figure that shows the area burned in the 11 big western states, not including Alaska, from prior to 1920 up until the current time. And what we see is this kind of U-shaped figure where we have a lot of area burned in the early part of the 20th century, not so much in the middle, and again a bit of a bump out here in recent times. Now, most scientists, managers, and the media will interpret this decline in this period as effectively being the result of suppression. Following World War II, we had a lot more mechanization, we had more roads, we had more access, and so we were putting fires out, and we did a pretty good job of it. And that the recent increase in area has been attributed to fuel buildup. Because of fire exclusion, fire suppression, that fuels have accumulated, and now we get more fire area burning and more intense fires. Well, I had the idea one day of superimposing our PDO phases on top of this fire area graph. And what we find is there's a pretty darn good correlation between cool and warm phases of the PDO and fire area burned. So if we see during this warm phase, we have this high area burned, during the cool phase, low area burned, and again during the biggest warm phase here, we have more area burned. So does this mean that this is controlled by weather completely? I'm not sure, but I really don't believe in coincidences either. So I think it's almost certain that climatic variability plays some role, and it's not just fuel accumulation that's controlling the pattern that we see in fire area in the western U.S. I looked at this in a little bit different way, and I have to attribute the idea for this to Professor Moat and to one of our former students here at the University of Washington, College of Forest Resources, and they broke out data for fire area during much of the 20th century and beyond for these three states, and took this threshold level of 200,000 acres area burned per year in those states. And if we break that out by warm phase and cool phase PDO, we see that during the warm phase, there's about a 3-to-1 ratio of big fire years. So this tells me that just this one factor of the PDO phase has a tremendous amount to do with the amount of fire area that's being burned. So again, this isn't the whole story, but it's a pretty big part of it, and it's not just fuels that are controlling the patterns of fire area burn that we see in the West. So where do we take this kind of information? How can we connect climate information with future fires? This is an analysis that was done recently in our group, and we found that for the state of Oregon, we looked at fire area, and we graphed out the fires on a precipitation versus temperature graph. The bigger the circle, the more fire area was burned in a particular year. So each circle is a year. The bigger the circle, the more fire area. And we see that most of the big circles are clustered down here, where we have warmer temperatures and lower precipitation. If we bump up the temperature a couple of degrees centigrade, as is predicted, then we can expect that we're going to get a lot more of these big circles happening out here. And when we do the math on this, it tells us we're going to have about twice as much area burned each year in a warmer climate in the future. And this is true throughout much of the West. We did this analysis for each state, and I'm pretty confident we're going to see larger areas burned in the future. One option we might have is to modify our stands in ways that we can alter the structure from dense stands to thinner stands and reduce canopy connections, the density of the canopy, and also reduce surface fuels. And this might be a way that we can mitigate fire hazard in some of our, especially our dry forest sites. A wild card in this is, again, the topic addressed by Professor Hinckley. Will forest growth increase at certain sites? This little graph is an analysis of trees from a lot of high elevation sites throughout the West, where we found a consistent growth increase pattern over the last 150 years or so. Is this due to carbon dioxide fertilization? We're not sure, but it's definitely a signal of change in the last 150 years. The last topic I want to mention is forest carbon dynamics. And we know that young forests can take up a lot of carbon. They're very good at that. They're not quite as good at storing carbon, whereas our older forests are very good at storing carbon, but not quite as good as taking it up. So how do we manage those forests? That's a huge question, not just scientifically, but in terms of policy. So what can we expect in the future? Well, I would expect that our dry forests will have less growth. Some of our subalpine forests will actually grow faster. Some of our more drought-stressed, low-elevation forests may have reduced growth. But really, things like altered fire regimes will dwarf any change that we have in growth and regeneration at small scales, because the fire disturbance occurs at very large spatial scales. And finally, carbon cycling might increase, but that's going to depend a lot on how we deal with that issue in terms of policy and management. How do we adapt? One thing that has been done already is using nursery stock that's more tolerant to low soil moisture. We can use a variety of genotypes or nursery stock with different genetic characteristics. We might think about planting mixed species instead of monocultures. We might want to retain some woody debris on site to moderate the temperature. And we can also perhaps use this concept I mentioned about maintaining healthy, so-called healthy or high vigor stands that would then be less susceptible to stresses like fungal pathogens and insect attack. And then finally, what can forest management do about this rather huge issue of carbon storage? Well, first of all, I have to say there is no silver bullet here. There's no magic to using forests as a way of completely mitigating climate change. The best we can do is probably take up about a third of global carbon emissions if we do a really, really good job of reforesting all of our potential forest lands. We can consider longer rotations that would keep carbon on site longer. We need to consider keeping woody debris on site or utilizing it for wood products. We'll hear more about this in the next presentation. We can extend the life cycle of wood products so we don't put carbon into the atmosphere quite as fast. And we can encourage things like recycling and reuse of wood products. And finally, maybe a controversial recommendation would be to continue current policies regarding fire suppression and fuel management. This is a choice that has to be made within the policy arena, but when you have big fires, you release a lot of carbon. So in conclusion, the bad news is we might be in for some big changes in forest resources in the future, and we don't know exactly what the timing and magnitude of those changes will be. The good news is we now know quite a bit about the relationship between forest resources and climate. And the other good news is Pacific Northwest resource managers have shown remarkable adaptability to change. It was less than 20 years ago that our primary management objective was timber production. And that has changed completely on public lands to a much more diverse management agenda of biological diversity, wildlife, water production, recreational opportunities. So I'm optimistic that if we work together as scientific community, resource managers, and decision makers, we can adapt to changes in the future based on good scientific information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dane. Our final speaker today is Bruce Lipke, Bruce is a professor of forest economics here in the College of Forest Resources. He's also the director of the Rural Technology Initiative and the president of Quorum, and that's a research consortium based here and in several universities that investigates renewable industrial materials. His research areas include forest economics, global trade and environmental policy, and environmental and economic performance of renewable materials. The title of his presentation is Carbon Storage to Solve the Problem from Forests to Products and Homes. Bruce?
Thank you, Rick. Now, so far we've talked about mostly the potential problems. Dave Peterson did introduce some of the concepts of some of the things we can do about them. He also alluded to the fact that the problem appears to be large, so we really shouldn't expect any single change to solve the problem. But we do know that forests remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's certainly moving in the right direction. So it's pretty important that we understand the complete life cycle of carbon and think about it in terms of a carbon equation. The way I'd like to start is, how do we store more carbon? How do we emit less? We know that trees convert atmospheric carbon into wood. So the forest is, in fact, a carbon storehouse. We tend to call it a carbon pool because there are many carbon pools that we like to differentiate. It's a solar energy storage unit, effectively. It can be burned for its heat value, essentially an energy source. It can be converted into products. Both of these things reduce fossil emissions, which would be good things. Probably the most important aspect is it's renewable. As we use wood, we also replant the trees, and that replaces the forest carbon, unlike if we use fossil fuels, which essentially takes the carbon from the soil, it gets emitted into the atmosphere, and it's not particularly easy to recycle it. The flow process is a bit complex in places. When you put it on a flow diagram, yes, the forests do, in fact, take carbon dioxide, out of the air with a little help of solar energy. If we produce logs out of the forest, we're going to increase some emissions in the processing to do that. If we run it into a plant to produce a bunch of products, we increase more emissions, and we may even have toxic issues in water. And if we build a house, we have another set of emissions. And keeping track of all these does get to be difficult, but it's important to do that if we want to understand the full impacts. So how do we store more forest carbon? Well, the forests in the U.S. now store about 11 billion tons of carbon. And certainly if you think about urban sprawl as one of the major changes, you would say, well, there's declining acres that are being used to support forests. In reality, though, over the last many decades, we've seen an increasing volume in biomass and carbon. It's coming from things like reforestation. As we manage our forests more intensively, we're growing much more wood on the acre than that we would have naturally. And there's been a fair amount of conversion of agricultural land just due to the high productivity of our agricultural sector. So I want to talk about the three major sources that the forests provide as carbon storage pools, the first one being the forest itself. Now, the Pacific Northwest forests, it's already been mentioned, store more carbon than probably a lot of other forests. The reasons being we grow bigger trees on longer rotations, and we have a large number of unmanaged old forests. We typically would see about a 29-ton average carbon per acre in a Pacific Northwest commercial forest on a 45-year rotation, which is what, as economists, we say is the approximate economic rotation in our region. If we let the forest grow without harvesting it, by the time we get out to 125 years, it's going to average something more like 76 tons per acre. Showing you a picture of what the carbon pools look like over time. I'm demonstrating here an 80-year rotation with two thinnings. You can see that the light green or blue-green is the carbon in the stem, which certainly dominates the amount of carbon there. There's a fair amount in the roots, the very sharp colored green, and there's some in the crown. There's always some litter, some dead material. And you can see when we harvest, there is an increasing amount of dead material in the residuals that decomposes or decays and goes back into the atmosphere fairly rapidly, so it goes out of the storage pool. If I compare that with a 45-year rotation, which is far more typical on our commercial forest, there are two decisive differences between these. If you were to look at the average between the two, there's much more carbon stored in the 80-year rotation forest than there is in the 45-year rotation forest. But the second thing is, you notice that when we completed the short rotation, we exported that material out of the forest, which means we have to track the carbon onto its other uses, and that happens much sooner on the short rotation. So the second big consideration is the carbon that gets stored in these product pools. Now, our commercial forests produce long-lived products, and they store carbon eventually in buildings. And we find about 25 tons per acre average over a 120-year period from this. And I've demonstrated here what happens to these product pools for this 80-year rotation. You can see that the amount of carbon stored from the two thinnings is relatively small, still significant. By the time you get to the 80-year rotation, the large area in the middle, the mahogany color, is our long-lived products. Just below that in orange, you see the impact of short-lived products, namely mostly chips going into paper products, and they will decompose fairly rapidly in the next few decades. Below the line, we show the energy required to, in fact, produce these products, and it includes both the harvest, which you can barely see, because most of it is in the manufacturing process itself. And then up at the top, we show the yellow area as, well, that's when we use the low-grade residuals as biofuels. So this basically shows that we can, in fact, produce most of the energy needed for elementary wood products through a biofuel route, which means, in effect, that it isn't going to end up contributing to long-term emissions. So that gets us ready for the third pool, which is the more complicated one, and that's when carbon storage results by the process of substituting for fossil-intensive products in the market. Our long-lived wood products substitute for both steel and concrete. We estimate about 51 tons per acre less the carbon emissions as an offset to the steel and concrete that would not be used, or essentially the displacement of the energy that would be required for steel and concrete. Now that turns out to be a very conservative estimate, as we'll kind of show how we've done that kind of analysis. This is where the complexity comes in, because we basically had this consortium of 15 different research institutions go out and measure essentially all the inputs and all the outputs of every stage of processing, starting with the forest resource, regeneration, harvesting, keeping track of transportation, then going into the mills, measuring all the inputs and outputs at each one of the mills, then going into the construction process, essentially measuring the inputs and outputs for several different representative designs of buildings, even including an analysis of the building use and maintenance, because one of the biggest uses is actually heating energy, and finally to the disposal or recycling of the product. We tend to call this complete cycle a cradle-to-grave analysis. That would cover a lot of years, could be well over 100 years. We expect the life of most houses to be something above 75 years. So this analysis does, in fact, get sort of complicated in the time sense. First thing I'll show you is just the impacts from the cradle to the output of the products, because we generate just a ton of numbers in this process. The surveys were conducted both in the Pacific Northwest for all the facilities there and in the Southeast, and the houses that were built were a representative cold climate house in Minneapolis and a representative warm climate house in Atlanta. Just a simple summary of many of the pieces of information that come out of this kind of work is the energy content to produce different wood products. You can note that if you use green lumber, which we still do in the Northwest because Douglas fir is such a stable product, that there is very little energy in processing. It's almost all in transportation. Very efficient relative to all the other products. The minute we dry the wood, which is designated here by lumber KD, meaning kiln dried, you see a fair amount of processing energy is required and a fair amount of primary energy, because if you're going to have processing energy at the plant, you buy it from the utility, you've got all the utility efficiency losses and line losses before you get to use it. Now, a good part of that is now coming from processing biofuels, basically burning residuals. Much more of it could if, in fact, the economic conditions were right. You see, for all the other products, which are, in fact, composite products, we use glues, so there's a fair amount of energy in the resins as well. But all of these products essentially tend to be used in long-lived structural applications. To summarize much of this information, we basically took the bill of materials and built a wood versus steel framed house in Minneapolis, common insulation standard, same R code. We did the same thing in Atlanta using a wood frame versus a concrete framed house. From this kind of analysis, you can produce charts like this where we look at the summary of what happens at the house level and what happens at a subassembly in the frame. The numbers show that the concrete versus wood design shows about 16% more embodied energy use to build the concrete frame house. Now, that may not seem like a lot, but wood only makes up 6% of the mass of the building, and it's a 16% change in energy. When you go to the above-grade wall, where the substitution is much more direct, the inference goes up to 38%. When you look at global warming potential, which essentially measures our emissions for carbon and methane, you see the numbers rise considerably to 31% and 80%. The reason being cement goes through a calcification process which emits CO2 independent of its energy value. Air emissions, somewhat less. When you do these kind of analysis, it might be a trap to just look at carbon. We look at all of the environmental performance indices, water emissions, air emissions, and solid waste. And in the case of solid waste, concrete is quite a bit worse than wood. Now, with that information, we can kind of stack our three carbon pools. At the bottom, you see in green the forest. I put a trend line through the peaks, which tends to show, well, over a long period of time, and if you had acres in all of these age classes, it would essentially be in steady state for a given rotation. When I add the products in, you begin to see that it's not in steady state. It's actually increasing with time. But by the time I add my displacement of steel and concrete benefits, it's an enormous increase in carbon stored, if you will, and that not only that, it's very dynamic and increasing steadily over time. We took the snapshot of those kind of pictures. If you look at it over the first 45 years, the bars on the left, and look at the different rotations, 45 years, 80, 120, what you'll notice is it doesn't really make a lot of difference. Almost all the carbon is still stored in a forest. By the time you get to an 80-year interval, you're beginning to see the effects of the products getting into the market, and that you have both storage in the product pool. By the time you get out to 120, the numbers keep increasing dramatically. By the time you get out to 165, they're really pretty sizable. And what you normally see, and what we see here, is that while the carbon stored in the forest is much less at the 45-year rotation, the carbon stored in all these product pools is substantially greater. If you put that on a scale for our Pacific Northwest, first compare it to what the Kyoto Protocol suggests. The Kyoto Protocol ignores all of the carbon in products or substitution pools as leakage. When you leave that out, there's no error in the first 45 years, but by the time you're in the first 120 years, you've left out 26 tons per acre. And if you put that over the private forests, which are in fact being managed on a rotation in the Northwest, that's 450 plus million tons of carbon. If you compare intensive management, could increase the carbon stored in the first 45 years by about 7 tons per acre. Over a 120-year period, that grows to about 14. By the time you look at it across the Northwest, that's something like 245 million tons for the region. And if you compare no management versus intensive management, or essentially no harvest, you would lose 11 tons in the 0 to 45-year period because you're not going to manage it as intensively. You would lose as much as 47 tons over the 120-year period, and that adds up to about 820 million tons of carbon, a sizable amount of carbon. Now, I didn't mention fire. Fortunately, Dave Peterson did. The point of the fire is, while it basically releases the carbon into the atmosphere in the process of the fire, the really important aspect is there's no savings in the fossil fuel or the substitution or the carbon product substitution that it could have. And not only that, it retards the regeneration of the forest, or at least most of the intense fires do. So let me go through a few take-home messages. We can assess the environmental performance of products and buildings. It was a lot of effort, but we know how to do that. There are many potential improvements by using less fossil-intensive products and more wood products. Just making the change in framing, which we demonstrated, is just the tip of the iceberg of the improvements that can be made. Energy for heat production remains the driving factor, both in wood processing, but also in all of the conversions of metals into products. Most of the wood products could be bioenergy, and they would be if the fuel costs were higher and the pollution control regulations did an LCI analysis instead of just putting on pollution regulations. The short rotations with intensive management store the most carbon across all stages of processing, even though it's less in the forest. Wood used in long-term products provides the greatest reduction in fossil fuel use and emissions. Substituting biofuels for long-lived products is not a good solution. And lastly, the forest fires reduce carbon storage. It's a lost opportunity, basically, to reduce fossil fuels. Just an acknowledgement, the kind of results I'm showing you here came from this Consortium for Research on Renewable Industrial Materials. That was 15 institutions, 23 authors. Department of Energy helped to fund the essential research plan, and the Forest Service did a large part of the funding along with 10 companies and about 80 of these institutions to do the research. Clearly, we could not have done this if the companies had not let us in to conduct these kind of surveys. Thank you.